Bună ziua și bine v-am găsit la interviurile Euronews. Sunt Vitalie Cojocari și discutăm astăzi cu Anil Seth. Este un profesor de neuroștiințe cognitive la Universitatea Sussex din Marea Britanie. Studiază mintea, creierul, dar și conștiința. Hello. Thank you for being with us today. First of all, I would like to understand how conscience works, because this is your research. Why is so important about consciousness?
How it works is, of course, that's the question we're all trying to answer. It's one of the oldest questions. The problem that we face is we have the brain. The brain is one of the most complex objects in the universe. It's about 86 billion brain cells and 1,000 times more connections. It's incredibly complicated. And somehow, through the operation of the brain and the body, we have conscious experiences. Now, when we wake up in the morning, it's not just there's this biological object that goes to have breakfast. We have experiences. We feel hungry, we feel thirsty, we open our eyes, we see things. So how is it that a physical object can have experiences, can feel things, can see things? This is one of the oldest questions in science and in philosophy. And it's a very important question, I think, for two reasons. Firstly, consciousness for all of us is the only thing that really matters. Everything that happens to us means something only because we experience it. We feel happy, we feel sad, we feel joy, we feel pain, we feel suffering. So consciousness is a very personal mystery for each of us, but it matters practically as well. If we try to understand and treat things like mental illness and psychiatric disease, neurological disease, these are often, there are often problems with the way we experience the world. So we won't, I don't think, properly understand and treat mental health conditions unless we understand how consciousness works.
You discovered a thing that blew my mind, because I tried to understand what you are saying, even in your book, Being You. Mm-hmm. It's about how we see the world. I mean, I understand, I see this table, I see this shape, the height of this table, but you see and you saw that it's something that is happening different in our brain. How it works, how we see things for our consciousness.
I think this is one of the most fascinating and counterintuitive aspects of this neuroscience of consciousness. And it seems to us that the world just pours itself directly into our minds through the windows of our eyes and our ears, as if we have this access to reality as it really is. This table, it seems to be just the way it is. It doesn't seem to depend on my brain at all. But we know this isn't true, that instead of our brains just passively registering the world as it is, the brain is always actively generating our experience. It doesn't mean that reality is false. No, the table exists for sure. It's really there. But the way we experience it, that's always an active construction of our brains. So we experience the world as much, if not more, from the inside out rather than from the outside in. Our brains are creating our experiences for us in ways that are not constrained by accuracy. Brains didn't evolve to see things accurately. They evolved to see things in ways that are useful for us.
Mm-hmm. I have a quote from you. You say like that: we are hallucinating all the time. When we agree on our hallucination, we call it reality. Explain yourself.
Well, I like the metaphor of perception, the way we experience things, as a kind of controlled hallucination. This sounds a bit strange, because normally when we think of hallucination, we think of perceiving, experiencing things that are not there, that are false, that are wrong in some way. And it's usually in contrast to normal experience, where it feels like we see things just as they are. But I think they're actually just on a scale. So when we are perceiving things, it's still coming from the inside out, but it's controlled by sensory signals that come from the world and the body. So our perceptual experiences are tied to the world in ways that are useful. But when that process goes wrong, our perceptions become uncontrolled and we start seeing things that other people don't. So that's the idea of controlled hallucination. Colors don't exist out there independently of a mind. There's just energy. There's just electromagnetic radiation. Our brains pick up 3 wavelengths of this energy. They're not actually colored. They're just 3 wavelengths. And out of those 3 colors, we experience millions of distinct colors. So when we perceive color, it seems as though it exists out there in the world, but it really doesn't. The artist Cézanne said, color is where the brain and the universe meet. I think he's really right about that.
You quote in your book, philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, that man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. My question is, if we cannot will our wills, there is somebody who can do that. It can be because we are seeing our today's researcher, that they are trying to put some computer and things in our brain.
So this is the question of free will. I mean, consciousness is hard enough trying to understand how the brain generates experience, but within this whole field of consciousness, there's this particular question of free will, which we as human beings find very important to our notion of what it is to be a self, what it is to be me or to be you. We feel in control of our actions. I can decide to pick up this glass of water and put it down. It feels like it's coming from the inside. But as Schopenhauer said, I can't easily choose what I want. I can do what I want, but I can't easily choose that. Now, I'm English, so I like to drink a cup of tea in the morning rather than coffee often. But that's just how I am. I don't decide that that's what I want to do. That's just built into my brain, that's part of myself. And so there's limits, I think, on how we express our free will. Yes, we can push these limits a little bit too. We can break our habits. The first step in breaking the habits is recognizing that they exist. But we can't do it. We can't arbitrarily change everything. We have a certain number of degrees of freedom, and we operate within those. But that's fine. I mean, that's how things should be. I think the idea that we can behave in ways that are completely unconstrained by our past, by the culture we grew up in, by the ancestors we have, that's just asking for too much. And we don't need that. We just need the ability to act according to what we want, what we desire, what we believe, what we think is right, morally and ethically as well. And by and large, we have that.
Mm-hmm. What we discuss right here is very philosophical, it's very hypothetical, it's very theoretical, but I would like to ask you about the potential implication on your predictive processing framework on fields such as psychology, neuroscience, and most of all, artificial intelligence.
Right. So psychology and neuroscience, these are the fields that these ideas come out of. And the core idea here is the brain is a prediction machine, and that everything that we experience, whether it's out there in the world or in here in the body, emotions and moods, they're all kind of brain-based predictions. And I think this is really important because it means that how things seem to us, just we wake up, we go about our daily lives, we want a cup of coffee, we go to work, how things seem is not always how they are. And just as color is not actually out there, it's partly in here. Recognizing that opens a little gap for us, and we can make use of that gap. We can recognize that there may be other ways of seeing things, of experiencing things, rather than taking things just the way they are. If I feel frustrated in a situation, instead of assuming that the world is frustrating me, I can recognize that this is actually something my brain is doing, and maybe that will help me respond better. So there are lots of implications in psychology. In artificial intelligence, things are changing so fast. And my background was actually in artificial intelligence. So I've been astonished to see the progress that's being made. And it's quite scary, actually, some of the progress that's being made.
In how many years you saw this progress?
So my PhD in AI was back in the mid-1990s, ending in 2000. But it's really in the last 5 to 7 years that this progress has started to take off. And in the last 2 or 3 years that it's really broken through into the public awareness of these things. And I mean, there's a lot to say about AI. I think it's going to be both beneficial for society, but also very disruptive and potentially dangerous in some ways.
Let's speak, first of all, about beneficial for society.
Yeah.
What kind of beneficial we can take from the AI?
One of my colleagues, a philosopher called Andy Clark, has talked a lot about the extended mind. We sometimes think of our minds as they're just within the skull. That's what the brain does. But actually, the way we think, the way we understand things is already dependent on the technologies that we interact with. My memory is already on my phone to some extent. And AI can extend our minds even more. It's a powerful technology that we can consult, we can ask questions, or we can use it in some ways to compensate for the things that human minds are not very good at. I'll give you one example. We, as biological creatures that evolved in particular environments, we're not very good about thinking in the long term. Now, we don't have emotional responses that are appropriate for things that unfold over decades or centuries. This is one reason we've been very bad at confronting the realities of climate change. We don't feel it because we didn't evolve to feel it. So we have these cognitive and emotional biases that really blinker us, that hamper us from dealing with certain kinds of problems. AI can really help us here because it can be free from the kinds of biases that we have. Of course, it can have other biases. That's part of the danger. But because it's so powerful at integrating knowledge from so many different sources, we can learn, I think, to use it as a complementary artificial mind. The key here is to think of AI not as an artificial person or as a kind of colleague, but as a tool that we haven't quite figured out how to use yet. I mean, I don't know if you remember, I remember the first time I saw an internet search engine in 1995.
Yeah.
I was amazed. You can type something in and you get information about anything. But it took a very long time for us as a society to figure out how we use it. And of course, it's used for the good of society, but also it has a bad side too, as we've seen with social media echo chambers and so on. The same thing will happen with AI. It can be used for extraordinarily good purposes in figuring out how we solve some of the pressing problems in climate change, in medicine. I mean, already AI has been used to help in drug design, for treating various illnesses. Things like that, I think AI will be very powerful for. But we have to learn how to balance the benefits against the risks.
And the risks are, a lot of people are afraid that AI will take their job, their job. It's a risk, it's a real risk?
I think so. I think with any major new technological innovation, there is disruption to people's jobs, to the way society works. So just as some jobs disappeared when calculators came around and computers came around, some jobs will be under threat now.
And this is bad because we know that when was this technological industrial revolution in UK, we saw a lot of people who are against machine that they took their jobs. So now we are dissimilar in some way. Is this a real risk?
Well, that was the so-called Luddites in the 19th century who would go around and they would smash these factories that were automating weaving of cloth, weaving of clothes. I mean, that's always been there. And it is an issue. And I think as a society, there's a responsibility to try to manage these changes. You can't prevent them. But new technologies also open up new opportunities too. There'll be new kinds of jobs, new things. I mean, most of the jobs that exist today didn't exist 100 years ago at all. They wouldn't make any sense, the kinds of jobs that exist today. I mean, this is not much comfort for a single person whose job is under threat. So that's why society needs to manage the change and make sure that the the disadvantages, the costs of this change are not concentrated on a few people, but are shared as much as possible. So yeah, there are threats in terms of jobs. For instance, large language models, which have advanced perhaps the most rapidly of any AI technology, they can write fluent language now. And so jobs that involve writing...
Like journalists.
Well, maybe. Well, you see, this is going to be interesting. I think journalists might be able to make use of language models, but the idea that they will replace is, I think, not there yet and overstated, because a thing about AI at the moment, and this is one of the risks, is that it's very good at mimicking language, but we can't really trust anything it says.
Yeah.
People say it hallucinates. I actually think it confabulates, it makes stuff up, because language models, they don't actually understand anything. They give us the impression that they do, but all they're doing is giving you a kind of average answer from the internet about what an average human being might say. So when we recognize there are still things that we can add, we understand what text means. We don't just predict what the next word is going to be. There's still a place for human minds. We just have to learn how to coexist with these things.
It will be appropriate that you will be interviewed by robots in next years, or it's about emotion that brings to closer to a journalist or an interviewer. What is how important are emotion in AI future and this domain?
I think very important. And we humans, we like to think we're very rational creatures sometimes, but we're a mixture of reason and emotion, and we need both to function in the world appropriately. And AI is kind of neither. It's neither rational nor emotional. It's a sort of statistical mind. It just gives us the most likely responses. And this is quite dangerous for us, because what AI is very good at, especially these language models again, is mimicking what humans might say. So language models might give us the impression that they have emotions or that they actually reason and understand things, but they really don't. And we humans, we tend to project properties and qualities into things. We're very anthropomorphic. So if something is superficially similar, we tend to say, no, it really understands, it has emotions. And that can be dangerous, because it will mean that we make assumptions and predictions about how these things behave, because we're basing on what we would do, because we feel an emotion, or we really understand. But the AI doesn't. So the predictions may be right some of the time, but then they're going to be wrong. And if we don't know when the system is going to suddenly behave very differently, that's a risk. Mm-hmm. I think this brings us back to consciousness, actually, because it's very easy to assume that an AI is actually conscious if it's saying things that you and I might say as conscious human beings. But the AI is not conscious. It's just an algorithm unfolding on a computer. And so if we assume that it is conscious, if we feel that it is, but it isn't, now this is again going to make us make assumptions about it that may go wrong. And we'll also end up caring about it in ways that maybe we shouldn't, and not care about other things like non-human animals or other human beings in ways that we really should. So society is not really well equipped yet for the situation where we'll be interacting with entities that we feel have minds and are conscious, when in reality they don't.
Very interesting. What could be other risks for AI? What you are seeing for today, not like just disruption, work disruption. Yeah. What other risks could be?
It's important to distinguish the near-term, immediate risks from the long-term risks. In the near term, we don't even have to think about consciousness. We can think about disruption, we've discussed, but also things like misinformation and disinformation. We've already seen with social media how much damage to society can be done just by amplifying content
like
that
Brexit.
People write. Like Brexit. I mean, yeah, I was always very much against Brexit. I feel kind of European. But yes, you can amplify any kind of content now. But what AI brings to the table is not just the amplification of content, but the generation of content. And you can't rely on it. Language models make stuff up. We have these image generation algorithms that can produce video that's indistinguishable from real video. This means that we just can no longer trust what we see, what we hear. People watching this interview might ask, are these people really there saying the things they appear to be saying? We are real. Yeah. But the AI would say that too.
Yeah. Okay.
And so this is problematic because societies, democratic ones of course, but other societies, they tend to rely on people having access to information that at least at some level they know is true. So I think this explosion of potential misinformation and disinformation is a real threat to the way societies work. AI also has problems of bias. The algorithms are trained on data, and the data is usually not reflective of society in general. There was a famous example of this with face recognition algorithms that were very bad at recognizing faces of people with dark-colored skin. And because the algorithms have been trained on people with white skin primarily. And these biases, they don't have to be, they're not deliberate. They just creep into the data by accident in some ways. So there's lots of threats in the near term about AI.
What about the long term?
In the long term, there's much more uncertainty. And the long-term threats often are motivated, I think, by science fiction movies. We worry about AI becoming more intelligent than humans and taking over the world. We worry about AI becoming conscious and things like this. Terminator.
Is that for AI to be conscious?
Well, I think so. I think it's very far away. In my theories about consciousness is very much tied up with the fact that we're alive. We're living flesh and blood creatures. And I think this is essential for consciousness. It very likely is essential. So in this view, we won't have conscious AI until we have living machines. And that's we're not on the way to that yet. But I might be wrong. And there are other theories about consciousness that suggest it's much more plausible. But I do think it's something that we should not even be trying to do.
Why? Why so?
Two reasons. First reason is that as soon as something is conscious, it has its own interests, not just the interests that we give it. Now, in AI, there's this problem called value alignment. How do we make sure that artificial systems behave in ways that are aligned with what we as a human society or a planetary society think is best? It's very, very hard to solve this problem because we can think that something is good, but we miss a step and suddenly the AI decides to wipe out all forests or something because its goal is not specifying to not do that. It's hard enough as it is, but when something is conscious, it has its own interests as well, and that makes it even harder to make sure that it's going to act in our own interests. The other reason, and I think in a sense the even more challenging issue, is that when something is conscious, it has moral status, and it has the potential for suffering, perhaps. And if we as humans create conscious AI and we create AI that has the potential for suffering, we have an obligation to minimize that suffering. And we're not doing a particularly good job at that with the creatures that already exist in the world, non-human animals. Our track record of minimizing suffering is not great. And the idea that we would bring into the world a potentially limitless form of additional suffering. By pressing one button, we could bring into existence in server farms across the world things that could have negative experiences. That's very challenging. So I think conscious AI is really not something that we should be trying to do. It's in the tech industry, often people say, well, we'll build it because we can, because it's cool. This is not the way to go. We need to be very, very careful and not do things simply because we can, but ask whether we should.
What about the thing that we saw already happening in USA about, I'm asking you about Neuralink,
yes.
Elon Musk. What do you think about that? What are the pros and cons about that particular thing?
Neuralink is the latest in the line of actually quite an old technology and industry developing what we call brain implants. So these are electrodes that go directly into the human brain that can record, that can what's going on, and can also stimulate, so you can change activity in the brain. This is a very potentially powerful technology because when we can interface directly with the brain, it brings the potential to treat a wide range of medical problems. Things like paralysis, things like Parkinson's disease, plenty of other illnesses that currently resist treatment. Brain implants can really help. So there's definitely a positive side to it. Now, Neuralink in particular are trying to develop brain implants that involve many electrodes, not just one or two, but tens or hundreds. And I think this could be very important. Neuralink recently got the approval from the US Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, to do the first human clinical trials. So this is a big step. But it's not entirely new. I mean, brain implants have been used in humans for quite a long time already to treat things like Parkinson's and even depression.
There are some ethical issue on that.
There are lots of ethical issues. I mean, the first one is that anytime you put something in the brain, you're potentially doing some harm as well. So there's a lot of safety concerns about brain implants. Some of them have been addressed, some of them haven't. Then there are other ethical concerns. For instance, is it an invasion of privacy? You know, if you listen directly to people's brains and you have data from their brains,
you could do that.
What do you do with that data? Now, I think there's a bit of concern here, but these problems I think are solvable. You know, you can have regulations about how you use data that comes directly from people's brains. So I think the overall balance for things like Neuralink is generally positive. The thing I worry about a little bit is that, especially with Neuralink, I mean, Elon Musk's advances over the last couple of decades have tended to be about engineering problems, building rockets, building electric cars. Now, the science of these things was solved a long time ago. It's mainly been engineering problems. How do we do these things in ways that are affordable and that scale? The brain is different. The brain is not an engineering problem. We don't understand how the brain actually works. So to treat it as an engineering issue that just by implanting a lot of electrodes will suddenly be able to transform the way our minds and brains work, I think that's a bit optimistic. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the future with Neuralink. And there are other companies as well that have different approaches. But I think we're still quite far from, there was a book called Neuromancer by William Gibson. I remember reading this as an old science fiction book. There's a world where basically everybody walks around with brain implants all the time and can give themselves any kind of experience they want. I think we're a very long way from that. But it's worth bearing in mind. And I think this is actually the value of science fiction. These scenarios often seem very far away, and they may well be very far away. But it's always worth thinking about them in the here and now, because it's always best to be prepared.
Mm-hmm. Do you think we could take our conscience and put it on a machine to have an eternal life? What do you think about that?
I don't think so. It's a very appealing idea, isn't it? Over history, people have always wanted immortality in some way. And I think this is actually what's driving the motivation to build sort of conscious machines. You know, people want to be able to upload their minds and live forever. I think this is very unlikely. I think we are living biological creatures, part of nature, not apart from nature. And we need to recognize that. And we need to just feel that we are part of the natural world, not try to live forever inside the circuits of some supercomputer. I don't think it would work. And I think it's a distraction from living the lives that we can live now and that we should live now.
Anil Seth, thank you very much for your interview.
Thank you, Vitalie. It's a pleasure.